So the original goal for this panel, when I asked Liz to host it, was really about making this real. We've talked about a lot of things today. What are people seeing in the real world? And the panel we have, Dan from Red Hat spends a lot of time in front of customers. Sarah, as you heard, spends an awful lot of time with customers, helping them implement. And Svi Koren has been with Aqua for how long? Basically since the beginning. 3 years, and as our senior solutions architect originally, and was recently promoted to be Vice President of Product Strategy, and so has seen most of our customer deployments and can share with you just what's happening in the real world, and then hopefully guide you a little bit in terms of what to do over the next 3 days at KubeCon and what you can learn. So with that, Liz, take it over.
Okay. So why don't we start by just a very, very brief hello from each of our panelists, just to remind everyone who you are, although Andy just did a quick job. Sarah, since you look readiest.
Okay, hello. I'm Sarah Young. I'm a cloud security architect for Vison in Australia. We're an AWS migration consultancy. That'll do if you know more about me if you heard my talk before.
Dan.
Yeah, my name is Dan Walsh. I am a distinguished engineer at Red Hat. I've been there for about 17 years, so I've been around for a while. I also lead the container runtime or container engine teams at Red Hat, all basically everything that happens underneath Kubernetes and OpenShift.
And I'm Zvi with Aqua, so I got a nice introduction from Andy, but I run the product strategy for Aqua.
All right. So I have got a few questions here, but we're hoping for this to be interactive as well. So start thinking up your questions too. But to start with, what would you say is the state of Kubernetes security today, particularly for enterprises? And are those enterprises making colossal mistakes that are going to come back to bite them? Svi, do you want to start?
Yeah, so the state of security is really between sort of confusion and panic. There's a lot of misconceptions about containers in general, cloud native, and Kubernetes is kind of looped in with that. The biggest mistakes that organizations make, in my opinion, is that they really don't start early enough to think about security when they start to implement their cloud native application. So it's really about making sure that there's good communication between DevOps and security. These two organizations, when Aqua goes into companies and we start to talk about container security, sometimes, and actually quite a lot, it is the first time where DevOps and security actually sit in the same room. And it's really funny because these people know each other, but really don't know each other. They're like, oh, you work for security? And it's fostering those conversations. So as you start your journey with containers, with container workloads, engaging with your security organization is probably the best thing that you can do.
Okay, I got a question for everybody in the crowd. The number one message I've gotten today is to run no root containers in your environment. So could I have everybody raise their hand who is not running root containers inside their organization? All right, we only have 3 or 4 liars in the back of the room. So I got a little, OpenShift has a rule that out of the box you can't run root containers, right? You have to toggle a switch off to run root containers. And I was at a government conference and a 3-letter agency was coming to me and they said they wanted Red Hat to change the default in OpenShift to toggle off, allow them to run it by default. And I said, well, why would we do that? You go into your thing and you toggle it off. And they said, well, a security analyst will ping us if we turn something off. So what they wanted to do is force everybody in the world to run insecure so that they would not get in trouble with their security officer. And they have something to do with disease control, but I won't tell you who they.
I think, as I mentioned earlier, Kubernetes, and I've been talking to some people at this conference, it's changing and evolving so much. I think in terms of features and security improvements, I don't think it's a mistake to be using Kubernetes, but I do think for any enterprise, it's a challenge to keep up with the developments and keep up with best practice because it's still evolving at the moment. I think it's really difficult, to be honest. Even if you've got like the best resources, the best security people. It's difficult to keep up with what is best practice, what isn't, whilst it keeps changing. I think in a few years it'll settle down and be easier, but I think at the moment it's just tough. And I wouldn't beat yourself up about it if you're not on the latest version, you're not doing what is now recommended. But I think you need to be aware of it and try and keep your finger on the ball as best you can with it.
So Sarah, you talking there about the kind of the amount of change, and absolutely Kubernetes is changing pretty rapidly. We've seen a lot of improvements in Kubernetes security over the last few releases, starting with RBAC and a number of improved defaults and all sorts of improvements. But are we there? And what's still left to be done from the Kubernetes level or for platforms as a wider proposition?
I think we're not there. I don't think can we ever say any product is really there? I know that's like a completely cheesy answer to that question, but I think especially with any kind of open source project, there's always improvements to be made. I think Kubernetes is getting there, definitely, like with RBAC and like being able to encrypt etcd, etc. But I think one of the biggest problems now is though that people have done enterprise implementations and they're on earlier versions. So it's all well and good saying, hey, Kubernetes version 13 has this, but if you're running version 8 or please not version 7, I think anything under version 8 is not great. But I think, doing those big upgrades, if you've already got something enterprise in production in enterprise, can be difficult, as with any kind of program. And I don't know, I think probably people catching up to the most recent version, I'd say, is even the bigger problem at the moment. There's definitely work to be done and there'll be more features, but I think there's been such big jumps that now if you're a few versions behind, like you're really behind security-wise, and yeah.
So perhaps there's a problem there in that evolution is just too fast for some enterprises to keep up.
It is, especially big enterprises. And anyone who's managed, ironically, the people who've probably really pushed Kubernetes and done enterprise implementations earlier and integrated it more into their environment are the ones who will probably find upgrading trickier. And yeah, it's cruel irony, really.
Dan, what would you say is still missing?
Well, I mean, going on what you said, obviously, working for Red Hat, we know about slow upgrade paths. And one of the things that we've been pushing a lot is sort of standardization, trying to take away choice. Because I think a lot of reason people get stuck in this not being able to upgrade is because they customize everything. Everything has to be slightly customized. And as we move towards containers, sort of like CoreOS type environments where they have gold images, we really need to stop asking for customization and start to really standardize so that we don't get stuck in old versions, and then we can. The whole idea of Kubernetes and containers and things is for rapid development, rapid advancement, and I think part of the problem is we bring back our old ideas of, okay, I can do that, but I got to install some kind of security software on the platform that doesn't work on the latest version yet, so I'm stuck. Everybody gets stuck into that cycle. But
well, I would say, to be honest, that Kubernetes is really just now catching up to like the very rudimentary security that any enterprise solution really needs to have, right? Encrypting your object store and where you keep your secrets really it's not something that you should, pat yourself on the shoulder, right? It's something that should have been done a long time ago. So that's one issue, and that is the fact that and I think it comes to the fact that in this Software Foundation and the people that run Kubernetes, I don't think that there's a lot of like enterprise security experts. It seems to be an implementation of what we think security should be, but not really what security should be for an enterprise. And the platform is going to take care of itself. As far as security, Kubernetes is going to continue to improve its role-based model and the internal encryption and the resiliency and the fact that Kubernetes is going to be less prone to attacks. Now, there's always bugs. You'll find a vulnerability here and there, and that's, unfortunately, is just the nature of the beast. But organization really should not mistake the fact that the security of the platform is the security of the applications. The platform is the platform and the application is the application. If you want to secure your applications, of course you need to run them on a resilient platform, but that's not the whole story. So the fact that Kubernetes is making improvements in security and actually, coming out with big announcements about really rudimentary security, I think is causing the uninformed to think that that actually is going to secure their workloads, and that is really not the case.
Dan, you already mentioned the preference of not running as root. Could you tell us something about what's been happening with user namespaces, which is obviously a mechanism will help people to not run as root?
Well, that actually helps them to run as root,
Okay.
but not as root. So anybody here heard of user namespace? How many? Oh, everybody's heard of it.
Yeah.
Anybody using it? All right, a few more liars in the room. So user namespace, right? So the big holy grail of security in the, at least at the host level, is this concept of user namespace where you can basically assign a non-root user to root. And so you end up being root inside of your container. So the way I usually describe it is you take UID 5000, you say inside of this container I'm going to be root. And then if I break out of the container, or I actually break out of the user namespace, I am treated on the rest of the system as being UID 5000. The problem with that concept has existed for the last 5-6 years, and almost no one uses it. The container runtimes have some support, Cryo has support for it, and Docker has support for it. But they only have support for a single user namespace. And the real problem with user namespace is that the file systems never had support. So if you take a container image and you put it into a container that's running as UID 5000, if the content is actually owned by root, UID 0, inside of the image, it can't use that content, right? It treats that content as -1. And the second problem, so what we've always needed is a shifting file system. So the ability to say, I'm going to take this image, I'm going to mount it with this user namespace, so shift all the UIDs. So I mount this image as a different user namespace and shift all the UIDs. The kernel teams really move at a slow pace as far as doing that, and for good reasons. Obviously, there's huge security concerns about doing that. So what we've done over the last couple of years is we've been moving towards choning, so building into our container runtimes the ability to chone the file, so actually do some manual stuff, and the kernel's been adding features to allow that. So we can get to the point now where we can get user namespace, and anybody that's played with Podman now, you can actually run Podman, which is a container engine that allows you to run multiple different user namespaces and run in each individual OCI container inside of it. But now we get back to the container engines that run underneath Kubernetes. And even though those engines have ability to run at least in a single user namespace, Kubernetes doesn't have support. So while Kubernetes theoretically moves at this gangbuster pace, they've had a hard time implementing user namespace because if a container engine's running with the user namespace, Kubernetes has to ask the container engine what it's running with. And sadly, that API has been sort of falling by the wayside. Hopefully it's going to be, it was supposed to be in 1.12, then 1.13, and now it's hopefully it's going to be 1.14, which is 1.13 just came out of Kubernetes. But so eventually, maybe in my lifetime or my career, we will get user namespace, but we're getting closer.
All right. At this point, do we have some questions from the audience? Question right here from John at the front. Can we get a microphone?
I can yell, too.
I'll
I
repeat
understand
it.
why Clara was created, but why not Container D now? And second, what's the status of Open vSwitch and OpenShift, given that you're shifting to kind of Kubernetes pod security? Is that still going to exist, or are you going to?
Okay, so the first question was.
Like today, why not Container D?
Okay, so
Why bifurcate already?
so first of all, Cryo existed before Container D.
Well,
Okay.
Container D is, it didn't really, it was a rename.
Cryo existed 3 months before Container D. There was a Container D. Anyways, I don't want to. Why do we have multiple file systems? All right, I view the the container engine, that the standards bodies have basically come out and standardized on what it means to be an OCI image and what OCI image is existing at runtimes. What the engine is, I believe, I think we should experiment. I think we should have multiple different engines. I think, what we've developed is 3 different ways right now of running containers. I have a problem, if you followed any of my tweets and stuff, I call it no big fat container demons, where I think the industry is sort of stalled out from a security point of view of lumping together different container runtimes into one. Building a container image requires more privilege than running a container in production, and running, sort of experimenting and developing containers requires different protections again. So the way we're developing Cryo is just for Kubernetes and running Kubernetes in production. And because of that, we are taking away capabilities that Containerd gives by default. We're exposing lots of security features, read-only containers, other things. So we're experimenting on how we can further secure stuff. And frankly, when Cryo and Containerd first happened, our goal was to split up what was Docker into 4 different things. We created containers image and container storage, which were 2 libraries, and we wanted to develop those separately and allow stuff to be shared. What happened was Docker saw that Cryo was actually getting uplift, and they created Containerd then. I know that Containerd existed for Swarm before that, but Containerd that you're talking about was created three months later, and it matched. What they did is they tried to match what Cryo did, which was putting in the pulling and the pushing of images into that. So. Open vSwitch, I really don't work at that level, but I believe it's going to support it. Anybody OpenShift people? I believe Open vSwitch is still going to be full supported as it's part of the CNI plugins, so I think it's supported. Anybody back me up?
Sorry, I was going to move on from Open vSwitch because I think that's quite a specialist topic. But I think you did raise an interesting point there about the privileges that you need to build images. And Svi, I wonder if you've got any thoughts there about helping people avoid creating vulnerabilities in their or exposures in their systems in the CICD pipeline.
Yeah, I think so. We talked about namespaces and running as root, and so it has to do. Part of the problem is that the initial base images that come out of the Docker Hub that we used to use, in the last 3 years, are all default to run as root because they're the base operating system, and this kind of goes to the fact that when we scan an image. Image scanning needs to involve more than just vulnerabilities. It needs to involve configuration, it needs to involve content, what's in the image, how it fares against organizational standards. What we're dealing with organizations that want to take their existing security controls and apply them to containers, that they have much broader controls than just the fact that you don't need to run high or medium vulnerability. So what we've did with Aqua is to establish our scanning in such a way that will not only scan for vulnerabilities, but also scan for configuration. We'll also be able to embed organizational standards in custom compliance checks, because it needs to be a holistic way to treat basically your operating system like it was a server. And going back to kind of the way that we communicate with security is we need to bring in the full gamut of controls that people have on servers so that their container images are going to be just as clean as the servers that go into production, including the configuration, the content, and of course the vulnerability management for those images.
Okay. Sarah, any thoughts about vulnerabilities that people are, or mistakes that people are making in their CI/CD pipeline?
I think sometimes it's just a lack of people don't think about security necessarily with their CI/CD pipeline. They just think about how they need to deploy and how they deploy successfully into the cloud and how they get things working. And security is often like an afterthought. Now, I know that security can be an afterthought in many situations, but I see it quite a lot in CI/CD pipeline. And like I was trying to say in my talk, you do need to think about putting security into there as well, doing some scanning before things get pushed, or securing your base images, which is, again, the most important thing you should do. It's often an afterthought, and sometimes when people kind of do it as is often the case with security, doing it retrospectively is much harder than just doing it in the first place. And sometimes people give up or they accept the risk, and which isn't ideal. And I think it's not perfect, but there are a lot of tools out there now that you can use to improve the security of your pipeline. You just need to go and look at them and do your research. Again, not something that not everyone remembers to do. So up front, do it up front. Do not try and do it retrospectively, please.
Let's see if there's another question from the audience. I can see towards the back. Do we have a roving mic somewhere?
Oh, yes. So here we go.
To your right and behind you.
I'm not paying attention. Don't worry. It's been a long day.
There's been some great discussion about how to prevent CVEs sneaking into your Kubernetes cluster, how to prevent bad RBAC. There's been no real discussion about zero-day attacks. What does the panel think of how to prevent that type of problem?
Yeah, so I can take that. I think one of the simple things to understand about a zero-day attack is that it is exploiting something that is essentially unforeseen, right? It's something that we can't anticipate. So our ability to counter it has to be thought of as not something that we need to look for maybe in the image, but something that we need to actively do with running workloads. One of the very basic things that Aqua does with a running workload is differentiating between processes that started from the image and processes that did not start from the image in a running container. And once we start to think about it like that, we have an opportunity to deny anything that didn't start from a particular image in that container. So that will take care of most of the end exploits of the zero-day attack. Now, somebody might be able to drop a payload in a running container, but they won't be able to run it because, of course, that process did not start from the image. So that's one strategy. The other strategy is, read-only file systems. There are a lot of ways to have stripped down, the way that OpenShift does, strip down permissions on the user, having non-privileged user that run as the default process of the container. There are a lot of ways to exploit the immutability of containers to provide that hardening layer so that somebody, even they might not be able to drop content because of a read-only file system, they won't be able to execute it because Aqua might prevent it, or they might not have the privilege to execute it. If they do it, they're going to do it with very little privilege. So we have the opportunity to deal with zero-day attacks actually much more efficiently in a containerized environment because of the nature of containers.
Yeah, I mean, he covered most of it, but I mean, really, most of the security stuff we're putting into container separation is all around handling the zero-day, right? I mean, the problem is you can't really prevent zero-day because it's preventing something you don't know. And so really what you want to do is make sure that you have the security as high as possible on the individual nodes. Have things like, SE Linux turned on, have seccomp rules that applied to the container processes, have tightened C groups, have, as he said, read-only images so that they can't write. And then the secondary thing is monitoring. So you have to OpenShift Online monitors all the time for bit miners and porno sites and things like that. So you have to watch all the time what's going on inside of your containers. What are they doing?
So I'm not going to say anything drastically different from what you guys have said. I think one of my sore points that I see, and I currently get a pop-up from a particular vendor who I won't name, who claims that their endpoint security gives 100% exploit and zero-day coverage, which clearly isn't true because that's the nature of zero-day, that it's something that hasn't been picked up on before. I think, like everyone said, with zero-day, all you can do is make it really difficult for anything to run or execute that shouldn't be executing, and have really good monitoring. As you should have your monitoring configured as best you can so that if anything's happening that's unusual, it gets picked up quickly. It's all about mitigation rather than prevention, because by the very definition of a zero-day, we can't prevent it, or may not be able to prevent it because it hasn't been seen before. So we just got to make it difficult. That's it. I think some vendors, no one in here, by the way, some vendors will try and say, yeah, we can stop 0 days, and you can't. It's a 0 day. That's the whole point. Like,
I think just stepping out from my moderator role for a second, one of the interesting things about containers is the fact that you're isolating these different functions, these different pieces of your application, and it makes it much easier to identify what normal behavior looks like. So as Sarah said, when you're going to spot these unusual behaviors, particularly if you've got microservices are only supposed to do one thing, right? So if it starts doing something that isn't that one thing, that's quite easy to, or easier to detect. Moving back to my question list, if you had to point out the single biggest risk to enterprises implementing Kubernetes in production, what would be your number one thing that you would advise them to do? Sarah, do you want to start?
learn Kubernetes properly. Like, I know that sounds really simple, but what I found is, again, because it's new, and I don't mean this as a disparaging comment against any enterprise, is that because it's new, there are a lot of, most people are still learning. I'm still learning it. I think most people would consider themselves still learning it. And even if you'd consider yourself to be relatively expert, the fact it changes so quickly means that you need to constantly keep learning. And I think that people can usually get a Kubernetes cluster up and running fairly easily. But then to have it well secured, etc., especially with the lack of defaults, can be challenging. And as I alluded to in my talk, I think sometimes there's this, you can have managed Kubernetes clusters from various different people, but I've seen a reluctance in business sometimes to use that because it's sort of almost an engineering point of pride that they're not going to use that because that's like admitting they don't know what they're doing. And I think that's silly when if you want to use it as an interim solution, while you're upskilling, I don't think there's any harm in saying, hey, we don't know this well enough, so we're going to use a managed thing because it's better than being breached. That's my take anyway.
Dan, number one risk.
Run OpenShift?
Oh, come on.
How could I pass up? How could I pass it up?
That's a solution, it's not a risk. No, it's the number one
You want to
thing.
run secure? No. I would say, what I usually say is, a coworker of mine once said that, Docker is all about running random crap from the internet as root on your host. So, but basically what I would say is, only run trusted applications, really concentrate on the applications, making sure that you've got the sort of the same thing you've been doing for years and years with your regular operating system. You don't go to hackme.com and download RPMs or applications and install them. So really concentrate on making sure your applications come from trusted sources and make sure the applications are correct.
So I think it was said several times today, actually every single presentation probably, that the default configuration of Kubernetes are just a starting point. And we need to make sure that our Kubernetes is configured properly for the use cases that we want to configure it for. Liz mentioned the CIS benchmark that is a good starting point. It's not perfect. There are some things that are some things are debatable as far as the security versus the usability. What we did with Aqua is we got ourselves certified by the Center for Internet Security to execute the CIS controls, so at least it's a starting point that is going to be trusted. And it's really all about a trust model, because at some point you're going to have to convince your security people and compliance people that containers and Kubernetes are good enough to run mission-critical applications. And that really has nothing to do with the inherent security of the system itself. I mean, the system itself needs to be secure, but you need to prove that you've done all the work in order to certify to run with a particular workload, especially if it's subject to a regulation. So the mistake that people do with Kubernetes is that they just leave it as the default and then go and run mission-critical workloads on it. And it's not that you're going to get hacked, but somebody's going to shut you down, because it's not going to be compliant with your organizational rule, and you need to be something that's certified to actually make sure that those rules are followed.
All right, Liz, we have one question out here.
Great.
We'll make it our last question for the panel, and then I'll wrap up.
Okay.
I apologize if this had been covered earlier and I missed it, but on the subject of building containers that don't run as root, when I previously tried this, I ran into a little bit of confusion when using official Docker images, because some of them seem to be built to run applications as root, like Apache or HA proxy, where other ones seem to lean towards running it as a specific user, and they seem to be getting better about that. But when you are building a Docker file, do you tend to just start with the base OS and install what you need and avoid like the pre-built Apache ones by Docker? There seems to be a little bit of a disconnect between how Docker makes some of its official images versus how the industry is going.
Any of you want to start on that one?
I just completely agree with you that there's a complete disconnect, and yeah, it's funny, yeah, because it's all the information, you know, everyone's saying, don't run as root, don't run as root, and then it's like, hey, the official images only run as root. I think from what I've seen, it's really contextual. Like, I would say ideally maybe you'd want to build your own image, and so you can only add in the bits that you need, and you can possibly change that. But, oops, excuse me. But I've also seen in real life that that's not always possible, and I don't know, I think at the moment it's a maturity thing that I would hope that Docker are going to change some of those images and they will lean towards not being root. But I think at the moment the environment, although we say don't run as root, don't run as root, don't run as root, I've seen a lot of real life cases myself where it's not that straightforward, that things don't work, and even if it's not the container, it might be other things linked to the container, and the whole end-to-end ecosystem won't work unless the container runs as root. And then, you know, what can you do if you want it to work? I think that'll change just with maturity. I don't have any more like advice than that.
There is actually, Bitnami have a whole directory of images that they've built to be more hardened, and I believe not running as root is one of the things they've done.
We're going to try and get one more question in.
All right, well, I just wanted to say, I want to blame the reason containers come requiring root is these damn distribution companies that basically package software like Red Hat. So if you look at the way software that runs inside of containers, they're all built with the assumption that they're going to be installed on a physical piece of hardware or inside of a virtual machine, and they're going to be started by something like Systemd, and then they're going to drop privileges. So you have Apache or Nginx or whatever is going to start as root and then drop privileges. So you end up not only having to run as root, and mainly to bind to ports less than 1024 usually, and you'd end up needing set UID and set GID capabilities inside of the operating system. So, and so really what has to happen is, sort of we have to rethink the way we package software. And, there's lots more companies packaging software than just Docker. So, so there are images available. It's just you're going to have to search them out, or again get them. Red Hat, we ship images that all come with the assumption that they don't have to run as root. So there are images out there.
Yeah, I would say though that some of the distributions are really just open source, right? So it's about time somebody just took the initiative and went on GitHub and reworked some of those files and contributed to those projects in a way that's going to make those images more secure.
All right, our
I
very
think that's
last
what Bitnami were
question
doing.
here.
Yeah.
Hi, wondering about practical real-world examples of using SE Linux with containers and how we can make this easier.
I think I can kind of start with that. The idea is that there are a couple of issues with SE Linux with regards to running as containers, because SE Linux really was not designed for containers. It was designed for full operating system. Apart from the structure of the file and the fact that you really need to know what you're doing, the fact is that it is still a discretionary option in the runtime of containers. So there's really nothing that's mandating that you are going to attach an SE Linux or seccomp or operaram or anything to a running container. And that's really have been the problem. Anything that's discretionary, especially in the DevOps world, is really not going to be done. So the idea is that we need some mechanism to either enforce the use of SE Linux or basically any other security service to run. And so we can do things like making sure that the deployment files that we use are going through a review by security to make sure that they include that. Aqua is a switch that can force you to run with SE-Linux or not allow containers to run without SE-Linux or AppArmor or SecComp. But to me, it's just a matter of it being too hard, on the one hand, to manipulate the files and really do it successfully, and also being discretionary. And that combination is killer, and that's why you don't have the adoption.
So I would actually say that SE Linux and containers is a marriage made in heaven, mainly because SE Linux has always been about controlling what a process can do based on definition. So with containers, we end up putting everything into a box. And what we do with SE Linux is we wrap those boxes and make sure that, I like to say, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. So we can lock from the outside what's going on inside of the container and prevent it from breaking out. So the two major breakouts that have been documented, two CVEs of container breakouts, one of them was, there was an open file at, which allowed you to open up / on the host and actually start walking the file system even though it wasn't inside of your container. That was a file system attack on the host. The second breakout was based on program processes entering a container and having file descriptors open inside of the process. And so you'd be able to, process inside of the container could attack those processes, get access to their open file descriptors, break out of the container and start walking the file system. SE Linux blocks both of those CVEs that came through the container runtimes. Basically, SE Linux protects your file system, so it's a great match. The difficulty with SE Linux and containers comes when you volume mount into them. So the volume, basically when a container engine fires up, it picks out a random label for SE Linux to assign to the process and to the content. But if you volume mount in, that label of the thing that's volume mounted in has to be matched the label that's being used inside the container. So there is :Z and colon lowercase z and colon uppercase z have always been the you can add those to your volume mount, and that'll basically cause the container engine to relabel them to match the content. But pretty much, we run we run everything with SE Linux in enforcing mode on all of OpenShift Online. All OpenShift 4.0 has SE Linux on, as well as SecComp and stuff like that. But as he said, there is power. Kubernetes has the power to go in and turn off containers. So you can basically specify in your YAML file that set up your security options to disable security features for it. But I would, obviously, I would recommend that you don't turn any of that stuff off.
Haven't got much to add there apart from, I think we've pretty much covered it there. SE Linux does have a bit of a bad rep. I was talking to someone about this earlier. It's got a bit of a bad rep for being really hard to use. I think it's improved a lot in the last couple of years if you haven't used it recently. Still requires a bit of knowledge to get it right and tweak it, but I think it's worth, if you haven't used it for a while, giving it another go because it's not that bad anymore.
Just read the SE Linux coloring book.
Liz, you want to wrap up? Or
Well, I think thank you so much for the panel for your time and your expertise. Thank you to the audience for your questions. Round of applause for the panelists.
Yeah.